Hello and welcome to Read Red. Today I want to talk about Wittgenstein's Nephew by Thomas Bernhard. This is the second Bernhard book that I've read. The first was The Loser and I loved it so much. I made a video about it last year. I recommend reading the book and it was a great introduction to Bernhard. I love his prose style and voice and the fact that he used the book as an excuse to just rant non-stop about a whole slew of topics. I also feel sort of a bit of a kinship because, like Bernhard, I also studied music and then in kind of mid-20s have made a kind of interests have just turned and I've become more interested in literature, I'd say. And so I kind of aligned with Bernhard on that. Looking at Wittgenstein's Nephew, firstly I read Wittgenstein's Mistress, which is not by Bernhard, it's by David Markson, and that's an incredible book. Now I'm onto Wittgenstein's Nephew, and then if you have any other Wittgenstein's X books, let me know, because it'd be fun to keep the trend going. But looking at the book, I was sort of prepared again for another Bernhardian, just, alright, let's see what he's going to rant about this time, but I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, to see that the book is actually a soft memoir autobiography talking about his friend Paul, Paul Wittgenstein, who's Wittgenstein's nephew, but I think it's like his Wittgenstein's nephew once removed, which is not as catchy as a title, but it's like Ludwig Wittgenstein's cousin's son, Paul. And so he talks, the general frame or the setting is just that the narrator, Thomas Bernhard, is in a hospital suffering from a lung disease, which real life Bernhard also did suffer from, and narrator's friend Paul is in that same hospital in a different wing. He's in the sort of madness insanity ward, and they don't meet in the hospital, but while in the hospital and kind of dealing with the intense boredom and just the experience of being a kind of sick patient, the narrator decides to sort of create a document talking about his friend Paul, who he can sense that both of them are sort of getting nearer to the end of their life, and because of Paul's kind of debilitating mental state, Bernhard knows that a lot of Paul's genius, which is sort of overshadowed by his madness, is not really going to be recorded, and so that's part of what this book is. He makes he tries to be pretty explicit, talking about how, unless you're Austrian, then the name Wittgenstein, we automatically just think of Ludwig Wittgenstein. We think about that one important philosopher, but Bernhard wants to sort of, he makes some comparisons and just says, like, this is actually a pretty immensely intellectual family, and that just because Paul didn't write anything down doesn't mean that he wasn't just as equally intellectually powerful as Ludwig. But for the rest of the book, that's just pretty much what it is. He's just talking about their life. He talks about Bernhard's own experience being a playwright and being an author and winning awards, and what that's like, and kind of navigating being around Austrian intelligentsia and how Austria changed over the course of their life, and some of the friends that they made along the way. So it's very kind of fun and a nice insight in that it's a short autobiography. But anyway, from here we'll just start reading extracts so that you can get some ideas of what the book is like. I cannot help recalling how, time and again, my friend Paul had described his uncle alternately as a genius and a murderer, and every time I saw the professor entering or emerging from the operating theatre, I wondered whether I was seeing a genius or a murderer entering, a murderer or a genius emerging. Nowadays, we're a lot more open to talking about mental illness and not just automatically saying like, oh, all people who are crazy are going into the madness or insanity ward. But Bernhard has a similar sort of open-minded approach, but in the sense where he's just like angry at people for constantly saying, mental disease, and like you're about to read, he often refers to it as this so-called mental disease. Not in that he's doubting Paul, he's much more critical of the doctors and the and so on, which you're going to get a great quote later. But even as a child, Paul had a predisposition to this so-called mental disease, which has never been precisely classified, having been born mentally sick, already suffering from the so-called mental disease that was to afflict him all his life. Until the day he died, he lived with this so-called mental disease just as naturally as others live without it. It furnished the most depressing evidence of the helplessness of the medical practitioners and of medical science in general. And then skipping later, this is great, just classic Bernhard rant. Like all other doctors, those who treated Paul continually entrenched themselves behind Latin terms, which in due course they built up into an insuperable and impenetrable fortification between themselves and the patient, as their predecessors had done for centuries, solely in order to conceal their incompetence and cloak their charlatanry. What made Paul crazy was that he channeled so much that his body couldn't take it anymore, and he writes about this here. Like Paul, I had once more made demands on myself in excess of my resources. I had made demands on everything in excess of all my resources. I had behaved toward myself and everything else with the same unnatural ruthlessness that one day destroyed Paul and will one day destroy me. Paul's mind quite simply exploded because he could not discard his intellectual fortune fast enough, which is a great comparison with what the Wittgensteins did, particularly Ludwig. I think we all know about him kind of giving away his inheritance. I like that Bernhard talks about the difference between his Bernhard's naturally cynical or skeptical way of seeing the world versus Paul's more picturesque way, where he says this is after describing an experience where they see a kind of orphaned child on the street asking for money, and Paul gives the child money, but Bernhard sees that the kind of scheming mother is hiding in a bush somewhere. Where the wretchedness of human beings and humanity was concerned, Paul never saw beneath the surface. He never saw the whole picture as I did, and the likelihood is, I fancy, that throughout his life he quite simply refused to see the whole picture, contenting himself with surface appearances for reasons of self-protection. Another insight that I really enjoy is that Bernhard talks about the experience of a sick person, but also a recovered sick person going back to their everyday life, and how it's not always sunshine and roses to just kind of pick things back up. And he says, when a sick person returns home after a long absence, he finds everything strange, and the process of familiarizing himself with it again, of resuming possession of everything, is long and arduous. Having lost everything, he has to rediscover it. And because a sick person is always deserted, to say anything else would be a gross lie, he must try to develop a quite superhuman energy if he wants to carry on from where he left off months before. He talks about how he likes living in the city because of the environment, and he goes out to nature because he has to, not because he wants to. I know nothing about nature. I hate nature because it is killing me. And elaborating on that quite a few pages later, the country robs a thinking person of everything and gives him virtually nothing, whereas the city is perpetually given. One has simply to see this and, of course, feel it, but very few either see it or feel it, with the result that most people are sentimentally drawn to the country, where in no time they are inevitably sucked dry, deflated, and destroyed. This is a kind of very personal insight. It's coming a little bit later when Bernhard is talking about how he didn't really have a whole lot of friends because he intentionally alienated himself. But he says, and today it seems to me that we can count on the fingers of one hand all the people who have really meant anything to us in the course of our lives, and very often this one hand protests at our perversity in believing that we need a whole hand in order to count them, for, to be honest, we could probably make do without a single finger. There are times, however, when life is endurable, and at such times we occasionally manage to count 3 or 4 people to whom, in the long run, we owe something, and not just something, but a great deal. People who meant everything and been everything to us at certain critical moments or certain critical periods of our lives. You know, just think about reading that sort of line in The Loser. It's not something that's going to show up. And he talks, I think this is another really beautiful insight where, like a beautifully tragic insight where he talks about, as you're getting older, it's hard to be around people who are so close to death because they just seem like embodiments of death. And he writes, I do not know whether it was because I was afraid of someone who was the embodiment of death, or because I felt I had to spare him an encounter with someone who was not yet destined to go the same way. It was probably both. One of the lines from the last kind of string, it's all one paragraph, so it's not one paragraph, but the last couple of pages, It seems to me that I was basically nothing but the 12-year witness of his dying, who drew from his friend's dying much of the strength he needed for his own survival. It is not far-fetched to say that this friend had to die in order to make my life more bearable, and even for long periods possible. That's pretty much all I wanted to say about Wittgenstein's Nephew. As always, I recommend reading the book. If I've made a video about it, I obviously liked the book enough that I recommend reading it. Let me know what other Bernhard books you recommend I read. I do have Correction, but I don't have any other Bernhard books, so happy for some recommendations. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.